You've seen the lines on social media probably of people waiting outside food banks, and you're talking about very similar things to the lines that you saw at soup kitchens during the Great Depression. Canadians cannot afford to feed themselves right now, so we're going to get into what is going on with food bank usage. It's absolutely exploded, as many of us know, but let's connect the dots a bit between a depression and what's happening now so we can actually see and call a spade, because I think there is a lot of nuance to this as well, to do with the debt servicing costs that have absolutely skyrocketed. Also, housing prices have absolutely skyrocketed, rent prices as well. So this is the hunger data, and basically it's absolutely shocking. So nearly 2 million people visited a food bank last month, and you've just got to think, because that's around 5% of the population, which I just think is incredible for a developed country to have 5% of the population going to food banks. And let's just contrast that with what happened in the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, soup kitchens opened across America to feed the hungry. People waited in bread lines that stretched for blocks. Some 80 years later, Americans are lining up for miles for free food at food banks as they are overwhelmed by demand. So basically, you had that happening in the Great Depression. So is it fair to say right now, even, is a Great Depression? Because I would argue it is. I would argue that just technology distorts things, and it also makes things look better than it actually are, because people are driving around fancier cars, because the overall standard of living has increased since then. We kind of can't see when the standard of living is collapsing, because we're always comparing it to times where cell phones didn't exist, many things didn't exist, and it was more basic times. And when you think in the context of what happened during the Great Depression, I think you can definitely draw the lines, and there are some scarily shocking comparisons. Calgary Food Bank is absolutely exploding in usage, as you can see here. The most recent hunger count report from Food Banks Canada show that food bank usage across the country, including Calgary, is an all-time high in March 2023. There were almost 2 million visits to food banks across Canada, representing a 32% increase compared to March 2022. And we're talking about last year, remember. The need has never been greater. The reality is, in addition to having a growing city, Calgarians are faced with those everyday pressures of inflation, increased mortgages, and increased cost of living. And you've just got to think, because even though you've had a massive amount of inflation, you've had a lot of new people that have moved, and people can deal with that. If the economy is in good shape and people's wages are actually rising and we're actually producing more goods and services, then people can deal with that. But when there's a lot of stimulus that's circulating throughout the economy, I mean, Alberta was one of the biggest recipients of federal and provincial stimulus during the pandemic, because it was one of the most hard-hit places in the country, and it has not recovered. There is a real estate speculation and bubble that's distorting things right now and making the economy look better than it actually is. And there's a lot of people that are moving here, and kind of this trend right now to almost move to Calgary. It's entirely stupid when you get past the facade and realize what's going on at the local food bank. Essentially, it's just another Canadian city that is in a depression behind a facade of better politics and lower cost of living, which is absurd. And then Daily Bread food banks see a record 300,000 visits in February. This is in Toronto. This is just baffling to me. Last month, Daily Bread Food Bank had over 300,000 client visits at its 200 plus programs across Toronto. That's a 40% increase from this time last year, and 136% increase from February 2022, according to the charity. I mean, that is unbelievable. The amount of people that are now going to food banks in Toronto. You've seen the lines on social media probably of people waiting outside food banks, and you're talking about very similar things to the lines that you saw at soup kitchens during the Great Depression. It's a very similar thing. Yeah, the photos aren't in black and white anymore, and people have got cell phones, and technology has moved on a lot since then. But the actual depression, it's absolutely starting right now, I believe. And the mainstream media won't even admit that we're in a recession, which I just think is absolutely crazy. It's crazy when you break down these statistics here, which which we're going to do now by the provinces. If we take a look at what's going on across different provinces, you can see BC compared to 2019 up 57%. Alberta is up 94% since 2019. Saskatchewan up near 50%. Manitoba, no statistics. Ontario up over 100%. Quebec up 97.8%. Nova Scotia up 27%. New Brunswick up 34%. And Newfoundland and Labrador is up 44%. And again, you got to remember the unemployment rate there is at double digits. So you've got, these massive increases like in Ontario of over 100%. I mean, that is telling you something bad. You've got the same thing that is happening in Alberta as well. You've just got massive amounts of people that are going to food banks. And I think this is just absolutely indicative of being in a depression that a lot of people won't even see or acknowledge, or they just think is normal now. I don't know. I don't really know what people think of this. I think it's horrific, really. And I think it kind of shows what we're in right now. You can get past that facade. So anyway, about 6 months ago, a young single father came to the Greater Vancouver Food Bank. He was working full time, but his rent had gone up 20%, and he said he just couldn't make ends meet. Unable to adequately feed his children, and with no other choice, he came to us. He was distraught, like many people. He felt the stinging stigma of accepting charity, of asking for something as basic as food. And the key thing here is he was working full time. He was working full time. And this is what you continue to see. And in places like Toronto, the numbers of people who earn over $100,000 who are going to the food bank. But again, how much of those dollars are spent because of the absolutely skyrocketing cost of living? And a lot of people will blame this on the government. Politicians like Pierre love to blame this on the government because it fits his narrative, which is he wants to get voted into power. But throw him aside for the second, because when you look at the private sector increase in the money supply, it makes the government increase look ridiculously small. I mean, you've got private sector debt that's up over 300%. When you look at just mortgage debt, you're talking about over $2 trillion in mortgage debt. That is credit created by the banks purely that goes into the housing market and inflates prices, because people aren't really specific when it comes to the money supply. They just say, oh, they're printing money. But in Canada, when they print money, it mostly goes into the housing bubble. So it goes into the credit bubble and the housing bubble. And when that money is made, it's made as credit. So it can be destroyed very easily, as we saw in the deleveraging events that followed after 2008, happened in the UK, happened in the United States as well. Canada wasn't really in a credit bubble at that time, so it didn't really feel the effects, and used that to actually springboard into an even bigger financial event that will hit this time. And I believe it will be global, but I also believe that Canada, because of its position right now, will be impacted even worse than most countries, along with Australia and New Zealand as well, because they bet so big on this housing bubble. This is not an isolated or extreme case. It's entirely typical. In fact, of the 17,000 people we currently serve each month at the Greater Vancouver Food Bank, last year we gave out £8 million of food, which is crazy. And then it goes to say like New York, Houston, UK are also seeing similar things, which is no excuse for what's going on. I would argue these countries are also in depressions as well, especially the UK. The laugh of it is right now, I'm in the UK, and they're already talking about coming out of the recession that they're currently in right now. But the way I see it, this country has been in a recession since 2008, and it's been in a depression, in my opinion. I mean, you've seen like everything just deteriorate and crumble so much in this country. And I think Canada is heading into a depression. I think, yeah, we were in recession last year, but now we're heading into depression. Whether the mainstream media is going to tell you that or not, I don't really care. I don't even think it's relevant, because the mainstream media in the UK and in the United States was saying, oh, we're out of the recession in 2009. And were we? No. No, we weren't at all if you're in the real economy like me and you and many other people. So our colleagues at the Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto say demand for their services is absolutely frightening. More than 270,000 visits in March compared to 65,000 per month before the pandemic. I mean, again, this is just a unbelievable, unprecedented surge. And if you have a population, if you have a country that cannot afford to feed itself, I don't think there's any better indicator of being in a depression, of economic collapse, than people being able to afford the most basic thing, which is food and shelter, of course, because those two things are things that people cannot afford in Canada. And that's why you see homeless people everywhere. That's why you see lineups at food banks. And that's why we're in this depression. And you might think right now, well, Luke, this doesn't affect me. I would just say it's a matter of time. It will affect everybody because it starts out with the poor, then it goes into the middle class, and then it eventually hits the richer and more wealthier elites last. And that's when things finally can flip round, and it'll only flip round in most cases for those people at the top, whilst everybody else suffers the ramifications, exactly like what happened in 2020. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I would highly recommend that you check out this video here. If you're looking for a VPN, you know where to go to expressvpn.com/marketmania to get around all the censorship in Canada. I will see you in the next one. Take care.